compositions are the core of whatever you do in After Effects. They compare to canvases or artboards in other programs that you might know, such as Photoshop and Illustrator. Basically, the composition is your construct, is the area where you will be actually placing the elements that will be creating your final product. Whether those are still images or any other source material that you're using for your final render, this composition will hold all of the layers that will make up the final product. Now, the reason why we are spending some time talking about compositions is because you need to keep in mind your target. Whatever it is that you intend to create at the end, you need to have a goal. And that goal is based on the properties that you will be applying to that composition you're creating at the beginning. So as an example, let's go ahead and create a quick composition. You can do that in either one of two ways. You can go ahead and click on the new composition button on the screen, or you can go composition, new composition, or use the shortcut Control N or Command N on the Mac. Now, let's go ahead and start by clicking on new composition. Now, this window opens up and it gives us different values that we need to work through in order to target a final end. These include things such as the dimensions of the composition, how tall and how wide do we need it to be. As you notice, it is done in pixels, and you can either choose your own values if you have target values. Say, for example, you're creating a web banner or a Facebook ad or an Instagram banner or something like that. You can enter those values here by yourself. You can simply click on those numbers and enter the values. You can also unlock the aspect ratio so that you're not forced to using an aspect ratio from the standard aspect ratios, which are 16:9 or 4:3 or something like that. You can also, if you're targeting something that is going to be broadcast, or you have a specific client that is requesting something to fit a specific format, all of those formats are listed in this drop-down menu. So you can go ahead and choose any of these formats. And by the way, these are just templates. You can go ahead and change them as you go through the process of creating the composition. So they are all very malleable. Because of this, we need to make sure that we keep in mind that for anything that we do in After Effects, and the reason why we're looking at the final target is because we need to have very specific numbers of frames to very specific dimensions to very specific points in time when we're making changes. And the reason for this is because once you set those, specifically talking about frame rate, if you make any change to the composition after you start working on it, specifically to the frame rate, then the position of your keyframes can significantly change, throwing off the time markers that you have set up for those changes within your timelines. What that means is basically any work that you've done can be shifted and you might get undesired results. So you want to make sure that you know what you want as the end result before you actually start working, to avoid that headache. You can always go back and reset all the keyframes, of course, because everything is malleable, but who wants to do that after you've done, days worth of work just because you chose the wrong frame rate? It's in some instances, if that is the case, it's even better to start from scratch. So in order to avoid that, go ahead and make sure that you know what your target will be. So in our case, we're working with HDTV 720 at 25 FPS. And that means we're working with a format that is going to be 1280 by 720, which is 16:9 in ratio. And we're working at a frame rate of FPS. Now, as I explained in last week's class, FPS means frames per second, and this is the speed of playback. How fast is my video playing back as I see it on the screen? You have different options for this. So if you're working from scratch on a project, you should know what footage you're getting in order to match your composition to the footage that you're getting in. So if you're working with, say, 24 FPS footage, or you're working with 30 FPS footage, you would know by simply checking the properties of that file before you import it. If you don't know, you can always import it, as you'll see in just a second when we import a file, and you will notice that the program will tell you what FPS that file was shot at, and then you can match your composition to it. That's one way to do it. Another way, if you're starting anything from scratch and you just simply want to animate, let's say, still images, you can get your pick of the different options that you have here, or you can enter your own FPS if you want to. And then when you output, you should know where you're going. So if you're outputting for something that is animation for the web, I would suggest staying, below 23.976. If you're doing video, then anything above that will work just fine. Now, keep in mind that we have different values for different things. These are what we call the animation area, where we have things that are basically animated, like GIF animations and things like that. For anything above that is strictly video or film. We have different numbers here that are sort of odd, specifically this one and this one. Those are counting based on what we call the NTSC format. NTSC is the video format that we use in the US, and this is strictly for broadcast. So if you're talking about television that you do through airwaves, then you need to match these settings. Those are basically what we call analog video. Where we used to use analog video, that's what we used to, these are the numbers that we used to use. So why 29.97 frames? Well, that refers to what we call 30 FPS drop frame. And basically what that means is counting every second equals 30 frames. But after a minute worth of video, we actually drop 1 frame. The reason why this was done was so that we could match the frequency, the radio wave frequency that was sent out, through which the video was sent out. And so that was what better matched for us. For UK video formats, we use 25 FPS, or what we call PAL or PAL video. And that's a different set of transmission that they used to use for their video format. So did the French. The French also use 25 FPS. So it changes depending on what video format you want to use. For you to make sure that you are actually matching what you want, what your goal is at the end, you need to ask your client what you want, what they want. If you don't know, or they don't know, then I would suggest just working on 30 FPS digital, and that way you will match everything, and that you can always shave off or change, what we do, pull-ups or pull-downs, depending on what we want, whether we want to bring up the number of FPS or down. Now, your gut will tell you, well, why don't I work at the highest possible frame rate and then bring it down? You could do that as well, but working at 120 FPS, it's creating extra frames that you might not necessarily need, which will increase your rendering time. And so you need to take that into balance. You need to match rendering time versus computer power versus the time that you have to create your project. So all of that comes into play. The default by the standard that everybody uses today is one of these two, 30 FPS or 29.97 FPS, unless you're elsewhere in the world, in which the standard would be 24 or 25 FPS, one of these three. So we're just going to keep it right now under, let's say, I'm going to change it to 30 FPS for now. And down here we have, oh, by the way, we didn't talk about pixel aspect ratio. Now, as I explained last week, pixels come in different sizes depending on the format that you're working on. So if you're working with any format that is specified by your client, then you would choose it from any of these. Things like anamorphic have to do with film. Others have to do with the actual, depending on the type of how the footage was acquired, what kind of camera and what kind of codec and what kind of, basically even the type of camera that was chosen. So you would have to have that information provided to you. If you don't know, then when in doubt, always use square pixels. So for all the projects that we will be doing in this class, we're going to be working with square pixels. Okay. Now down here, this section refers to anything that you do in terms of your work space, meaning while you're working in your composition, how do you want the resolution of the files that you're looking at on the screen to appear? If you want them to be as they look when they go out, then you would maintain this at full resolution. Changing this here doesn't change the quality of the footage that you are going to be exporting. Before you export, you always go back to your full resolution. So you can choose any of these options. I keep mine at full because this is something you can change in the actual composition window fairly fast, and it doesn't affect the way the footage looks on the output. So this is something that by default I keep at full when I'm creating my compositions, but I always can, if I'm running low in RAM, then I can always lower the resolution in order to take advantage of having more video previews or faster previews based on the amount of RAM that you have. Then start code is basically, where do we start counting? What is the value for the very first frame that we are going to be having in this composition. And since we're working on base 30, and I choose 0 to start, but if you need to match another composition or another video, then you would have that SEMPTY code. The SEMPTY code is basically the address of every frame within your composition. Each frame has a number, whether it is through SEMPTY code, which is measured by hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. So 30, this starts counting 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 29. When it goes to 30, it doesn't go to 30, it goes to 0, and then it adds 1 second here, and so on and so forth until you get to the hours. Now, the SEMPTY code addresses each one of the frames in your composition. In this case, we only have 10 seconds worth of animation in our composition, so that's all that is going to address. It's only going to address 10 seconds. But you can, and because we're working on the standards from here, we're counting the SEMPTY code in the addresses, sorry, for each one of the frames in SEMPTY code. But you can also count them in frames if you need to. So for example, if you're working on a film, in a film project, you can change that value of from SEMPTY code to frames, and I'll show you how to do that once we create the composition. Now, notice that these are separated by colons. Each one of these two numbers is separated by colons. Now, if I go ahead and change my 30 FPS to 2997, now it's separated by semicolons. And now you know the difference between, visual difference in the SEMPTY code between a 30 FPS and a 30 FPS drop frame, which is what this is. 30 FPS drop frame is this one. 30 FPS flat or regular is the actual 30 frames. Remember, 30 FPS drop frame will count to 1 minute and then drop 1 frame due to the frequency issue for the radio frequency to be able to broadcast. Remember that. So you have the option to say drop frame or non-drop frame, and you'll notice that it changes the little colons to semicolons. So that's what that indicates within your SEMPTY code, if you ever encounter that. And then down here we have the background color for our composition. Remember, background color is just for your construct while you're building. When you go render, this will render transparent. So you need to make sure that you have something in the background in order to not render transparency, or tell the composition to render the flat background. Under the second tab, we have the advanced options. These options have to do with how we see the world. And as you can see right here, the main thing for us here is the motion blur area. By default, the program acts as if it's looking at the world through a camera. In this camera, you can control the amount of blurriness within the motion in your layers, or the changes in transformations in your layers. So you could increase the amount of, or decrease the amount of shutter angle, or you can increase the amount of samples, or increase them or decrease them in order to exaggerate or remove all of the blurriness out of your layers in your compositions. Now, if you look at things in the real world, when they move, they really look like they are blurry. If things are moving, you don't really see things sharp. You see them as they're starting increasing in speed, or in changing in position, or changing, moving in some way or fashion, and you're looking at that motion, you know what the object is because your brain tells you what it is. But you're really looking at a blur because your eye is catching that blur motion. So you can exaggerate that by using these settings, and we will be seeing this in a future class, how to change these values. 3D render refers to the actual 3D rendering engine that the program comes with. Now, there are two rendering engines in After Effects. One is the classic 3D rendering engine, and the other one is the Cinema 4D rendering engine. The classic 3D rendering engine gives you basically traditional 2.5D rendering options, what we call 2.5D. And basically every layer that you turn into a 3D layer in After Effects becomes a flat representation of, imagine, if you will, a rectangle, almost like a decal of whatever you were looking at. There is no true 3D with the classic 3D environment. If you want to start extruding things in After Effects, so things such as shapes, or if you want to import files from 3D programs such as Cinema 4D or 3D Studio Max, then you need to be working with the Cinema 4D rendering engine. And it's just as simple as to clicking on it, and it just switches it for you. Now, when you do that, it will tell you what has been enabled, and what has been disabled. So there's a trade-off on these things. If you're working with an older version of After Effects, you probably still have access to an old engine that they had, which was which rendered a lot better than Cinema 4D because it allowed all of these things to be available, but it renders really slow. So after much debate, Adobe decided to drop them because it just took forever to render with that engine. But it allowed you to do a lot. It was a lot more flexible in terms of constructing. It just took forever to render with that engine. So they chose to maintain the Cinema 4D, which works just fine if your workflow is taking you in the direction of working with 3D elements. If you are truly working with 3D elements, then my suggestion is that you start looking for other plugins such as Element 3D to bring in 3D environments into After Effects and work through a third party, just like you would with Cinema 4D. In this case, Element 3D is a plugin that allows you to work inside After Effects, but it's almost like a mini program within After Effects that allows you to manipulate your 3D objects as if you were working in the 3D program. So it's an extremely helpful plugin. I find myself using it all the time in combination with working with Cinema 4D Lite. And so I guess that's a long way around to say that there's not just one shot for everything. Basically, you have options. And so you need to look for those options when you're working, in order to increase your workflow, your workflow speed and efficiency. So let me go ahead and change the name of this comp to intro. And I am just simply going to click OK, and the program comes to live. Now, over here on the left-hand side, we have the project window, and we find the information for that particular composition when we select it shown up here in this preview window. It basically shows me whatever the values for that composition. Quick view at the values of that composition window. Now, if I want to go ahead and change, as I said, this empty code, let's say, oh, I'm not working for a film. I'm not working for a video. I'm actually going to be working for a film. You simply press the Control key on the keyboard and click on the SMPTE code, and it changes the frames from counting in SMPTE code to actual frames. As you can see, it's just going through all of the frames. So if I want to go back to SMPTE code, press Control and click on the SMPTE code again, and it gives you the actual SMPTE code on 30 FPS as we had created it. So those are the settings for the composition when you're creating it. Now, once you create it, basically everything becomes available to you. All of these icons that you see down here refer to things that you can do while you are working on the creation part of the composition, meaning as you are creating. They do not affect your final render. The one thing that is important here, there's many things that are important here, but things to know off the bat include this drop-down menu, which allows you to activate your action safe and title safe areas, and I'll explain that in class what that means, or probably by now I've already explained what it is. You also could have a proportional grid if you want to. You can have an actual grid. You can turn them off one at a time. You can use guides or turn off guides. Guides are just like you have them in Photoshop. So for example, if I want to bring in a guide, I activate rulers, and I can click on a ruler and bring in a guide. Just like you would in Illustrator or Photoshop, you do the same thing over here. So it works the same way. You can go ahead and hide that. And you can, from this drop right here, this one actually allows you to toggle the visibility of masks. You'll see what that means when we start talking about masking. This is your SMPTE clock. So this and this are pretty much the same thing. So if I click on that, it opens up a window that allows me to enter a specific time. So say I want to go to 1 second. I'll press 1 second, 0 frames. And that takes my time marker, the blue marker down here on the composition, to the 1 second mark. So I can navigate that. I can also click on this one and enter a value like 200, and that takes me to the 2 second mark. Now you'll notice that I am entering seconds and frames. That's how you navigate through the SMPTE code. You need to keep in mind that you're working with frames and seconds. So 200 is actually 2 seconds and 0 frames. Now, the one that I wanted to focus on right now is this one, which is the ability that you have to change the quality of your preview. Now, while you are working, it doesn't matter what quality you work at. The lower the quality, the more RAM you're saving. So your previews will be pretty long if you want to. Unfortunately, After Effects doesn't do real-time preview like you would in a video editing program such as Premiere Pro or Premiere, sorry. If you're working in After Effects, it actually has to render a preview for you. It's actually creating a file as it goes. So it takes quite a bit for it to actually render. And it's rendering onto your RAM. So what's happening is biting off your RAM to create that render. If you don't have a lot of RAM, your previews will be fairly short. But in most instances, when we're working with After Effects, our shots are not that long anyway. So you're not talking about creating hours of video footage for a preview. You will probably be previewing 3, 4, 5 seconds at a time in order to see that whatever visual effect you have created or added to the footage is actually working properly. And you can do that also if you're running low in RAM, like I said, by lowering these things, you will see the effect at a lower quality. Basically, you'll see bigger pixels, but you will be able to see the whole thing. And then by the end, when you're ready to render the whole thing, you can go back to full, and then your footage will render perfectly at the end. It'll go out as a final movie in full quality. Now, you also have the ability to change cameras, and this all refers to 3D views. We're going to be talking about 3D fairly soon. So you have the ability to change the position or create your own cameras. You have the ability to see more than one view. So when you're working in 3D, for those of you who have taken the Maya class or who have ever worked in 3D, you have the ability to change the views setups here just like you would in a program in 3D programs. Now, they don't match the 3D programs, the 4-grid that we see in programs like 3ds Max or Maya, but you have the ability to activate different cameras, basically, which helps you quite a lot when you're working in 3D. And so you can also lower the quality of the previews here, so you can change from adaptive to fast draft and so on. All of these things help you speed up your process as you're creating previews, but they lower the quality of what you are previewing, so keep that in mind. Okay, you can also change the exposure, meaning increasing the lightness or darkness of your whatever you're previewing if you want to, and you can reset that exposure by using these different options. So, I mean, all of these things, all of these options down here, and we'll see all of them throughout the semester, have to do with the composition settings, what you're working on with the composition settings. If you ever want to go back and change the composition settings, all you got to do is select the composition and go to composition settings, or use the shortcut Control K, and that will give you the option to open up the window that you started with, and you can go in and change anything you want. The thing that I advise you to at least to keep in mind that you never want to change is your frame rate. Make sure that you never change your frame rate because that throws off your keyframes. So know what your frame rate final output is going to be in order to input it into this window here. If you don't know, 30 FPS is the default, and I much rather work everything 30 FPS and then try to do a pull down or a pull up as necessary based on whatever output is, if it changes, of the actual render file, as opposed to having to go back and change all of my keyframes, because that is just too time consuming and it just becomes unmanageable. So my advice is to make sure as much as you can to know where you're going with that frame rate. Remember, frame rate is the speed of playback. Okay, so let me cancel this. And the composition, as I said in last week's class, this composition window is tied to this timeline, and it is in this timeline that we actually start building the layers for our product. So anything that we bring in, those layers will be set up. Anything that we bring in as source footage that we want to place within this composition will appear here. The layers will be stacked up from top to bottom, so whatever is at the bottom will appear to be behind in this composition. This only changes when you are working in 3D environments. In 3D environments, the stacking up of the layers changes. It's no longer relevant because now you're working on Z-axis. You're working on the depth. You're no longer working on X and Y only. You're working with the Z-axis as well. And so you can push things into 3D space or bring them towards the camera. And so that's the only thing that changes. But for anything else that is 2D, the stack up order of the layers determines how far behind or how in front they appear. We're going to be talking about all these switches, all these things that you see here as we activate and as we bring in layers. They become active for each one of the layers depending on the type of footage that you're using, the type of source that is creating that layer. And so we're going to be talking about all these little things that we call the switches area as we progress and as we start working on layers. So for now, this is a short intro to compositions and the things that you should take into account when you are creating compositions towards your final product.